What if an old stretcher could whisper secrets from the past? Would it tell you about midnight runs through bombed-out streets? About hands that refused to shake even when the world was falling apart? In the forgotten corners of Burlington, Vermont, where winter never seems to end and history sleeps under layers of snow, a 1940 military ambulance sat abandoned behind a collapsed barn. Everyone called it junk. Everyone except Rebecca Martinez. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She didn't buy it for glory. She didn't buy it for profit. She bought it because something in those rusted doors called to her like a voice she'd been waiting her whole life to hear. What Rebecca found beneath that stretcher wasn't just history. It was a medical breakthrough that had been buried for over 80 years. A discovery so revolutionary that someone had tried to erase it completely. This is the story of how a stubborn woman with a toolbox uncovered a secret that would change emergency medicine forever. But first, she had to survive the laughter, the doubt, and the truth that some people will do anything to keep buried. The auction house smelled like cigarettes and broken dreams. Rebecca Martinez stood in the back corner, her worn leather jacket zipped tight against the February cold seeping through the warehouse walls. Around her, dealers and collectors clustered around vintage furniture and dusty antiques, their voices echoing off concrete floors. But Rebecca wasn't looking at the mahogany dressers or the crystal chandeliers. Her eyes were fixed on lot number 47. The 1940 Dodge ambulance sat like a wounded animal in the corner, its white paint so faded it looked gray. Rust eating through the wheel wells like cancer. The red cross on its side had nearly disappeared, leaving only ghost marks where pride once lived. The rear doors hung crooked on broken hinges, and through the gap Rebecca could see the interior drowning in shadows and decay. "You're not seriously considering that piece of junk, are you?" Rebecca turned to find Harold Pembroke, a local antique dealer with more money than sense and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had been circling her like a vulture ever since she'd walked in, probably wondering what a 28-year-old automotive restoration specialist was doing at an estate auction in rural Vermont. "Just looking," Rebecca replied, keeping her voice neutral. She'd learned long ago not to show her hand too early. In her line of work, enthusiasm was expensive. Harold chuckled, the sound sharp and dismissive. "That old war wagon's been sitting behind the Fitzgerald barn for 30 years. Mice have made condos in the engine block. The transmission's probably seized solid. You'd spend 10 grand just to make it roadworthy, assuming the frame isn't completely rotted through." Other bidders had started to notice their conversation. A woman in a fur coat snorted with laughter. "Harold's right, honey. That thing's only good for scrap metal." "Maybe the wheels are worth something." "If they even turn," added a man in overalls, tobacco stains yellowing his beard. "Old military vehicles are nothing but trouble. Parts are impossible to find, and the electrical systems were garbage even when they were new." Rebecca nodded politely, but inside, something was burning. She'd heard this song before. The automatic dismissal, the condescending tone, the assumption that she didn't know what she was looking at. It was the same melody that played when she bought her first project car at 17, when she'd opened her restoration shop at 25, when she'd bid on the 1953 fire truck that everyone said was beyond saving. That fire truck now sat in the Shelburne Museum, fully restored and gleaming. "Lot 47, the auctioneer called, his voice cutting through the chatter. 1940 Dodge ambulance, military surplus. Let's start the bidding at $500. The warehouse fell quiet, except for the hum of the space heaters. Rebecca could feel eyes on her, waiting to see if the crazy girl with the toolbox would actually throw money at the rust bucket. She raised her hand. "500 to the young lady in the back. Do I hear 6? Silence. The auctioneer tried again. "550. Anyone?" More silence. Someone in the crowd whispered something that made others laugh. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her hand up, steady as a rock. "Going once," said 500. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. "Going twice." "Wait!" A voice called from the front of the crowd. Rebecca's stomach dropped as she recognized the speaker, Thomas Whittemore, owner of 3 auto shops in Burlington, and a man who collected vintage vehicles like some people collected stamps. He had the kind of money that could make $500 feel like pocket change. The auctioneer looked between them like a tennis referee. The crowd had gone completely silent now, sensing blood in the water. Rebecca could feel her savings account getting lighter with each bid, but something deeper than logic was driving her forward. This wasn't just about the ambulance anymore. It was about every time someone had told her she couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't. 1,100, she said. Whitmore hesitated for the first time. Rebecca saw him glance around the room, measuring the entertainment value against the actual cost. $1,000 was a joke to him. 1,100 was still manageable, but how high was this crazy woman willing to go for a pile of rust? 1,200, he said, but there was less confidence in his voice now. Rebecca took a deep breath. This was more than she'd planned to spend, more than the ambulance was probably worth in any reasonable universe. But reason had left the building the moment she'd first laid eyes on those broken doors and that faded red cross. 1,500, she said. The room exploded in whispers. Harold Pembroke actually laughed out loud. "That's just throwing money away," he announced to anyone who would listen. 1,500 for something that belongs in a junkyard. Whitmore studied Rebecca's face, looking for signs of bluff or uncertainty. He found neither. After a long moment, he shook his head and stepped back. "Going once at 1,500? The auctioneer called. "Going twice?" The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo forever. "Sold to the young lady in the back for $1,500. As Rebecca walked to the front to complete her paperwork, she could hear the comments following her like a wake. "More money than brains. That thing'll never run again. She'll be lucky to get 500 in scrap value. Poor girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." But Rebecca didn't care about the voices. She was thinking about the way the afternoon light had caught the ambulance's windshield, creating shadows and patterns that seemed almost deliberate. She was thinking about the stories that old machine could tell, the lives it might have saved, the history sleeping in its bones. Most of all, she was thinking about something she'd noticed when she'd walked past it earlier, something the mockers and the doubters had missed because they'd been too busy looking at the rust to see the details. The stretcher rails inside the ambulance weren't standard military issue. They'd been modified, reinforced with extra brackets and strange hinges that didn't match any design she'd ever seen. And there were marks on the floor, worn patterns that suggested equipment had been bolted down in very specific configurations. Someone had turned this ambulance into something more than just a transport vehicle. Someone had been doing medical work inside it, serious, complex medical work that required custom modifications and precise setup. The question was, what kind of work? And why had it been abandoned and forgotten for 30 years? Rebecca signed the papers with steady hands, ignoring the continued murmurs from the crowd. Let them laugh. Let them think she was a fool with more passion than sense. She'd heard it all before, and she'd proven them wrong every time. As she walked out into the Vermont cold, keys to the ambulance heavy in her pocket, Rebecca Martinez had no idea that she'd just purchased more than a restoration project. She'd bought a mystery that would lead her into the darkest corners of medical history, a cover-up that cost lives, and a discovery that would revolutionize emergency medicine. But first, she had to get the damn thing started. The snow was beginning to fall as she approached the ambulance for the first time as its owner. Behind her, she could hear Harold Pembroke still holding court, regaling anyone who would listen with predictions of her inevitable failure. Rebecca pulled out her flashlight and clicked it on. It was time to see what $1,500 and a room full of laughter had bought her. It was time to listen to what the ambulance had been trying to say. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The lock on the ambulance's rear doors had rusted solid, but Rebecca had come prepared. She pulled a can of penetrating oil from her jacket pocket and soaked the mechanism, then worked her lockpicks with the patience of a surgeon. The cold made her fingers stiff, but she'd learned to work through discomfort years ago. When the lock finally gave way with a metallic click, the doors swung open on hinges that screamed like wounded animals. The smell hit her immediately. Not the musty odor of abandonment she'd expected, but something sharper, antiseptic. Even after decades, the ghost of medical chemicals lingered in the air like a memory that refused to fade. Rebecca climbed into the back of the ambulance and swept her flashlight across the interior. The stretcher dominated the space, its canvas surface torn and stained, but the frame beneath was solid military steel. What caught her attention weren't the obvious signs of decay, it's what had been preserved. The walls were lined with custom cabinets, their doors secured with latches that definitely weren't standard military issue. These were precision mechanisms, the kind used in laboratory equipment where vibration could ruin delicate instruments. Someone had spent serious money retrofitting this ambulance for purposes far beyond basic battlefield medicine. She ran her hands along the stretcher rails, feeling the modifications she'd noticed from outside. The brackets were hand-machined, designed to hold equipment that needed to remain perfectly stable even while the ambulance was moving. But what kind of equipment required that level of precision in 1940? Rebecca pulled out her phone and used its flashlight to supplement her beam. In the brighter light, she could see scratches in the metal floor. Not random wear patterns, but deliberate markings. Someone had used a sharp instrument to etch numbers and symbols into the steel. Coordinates, maybe, or measurements. One of the wall cabinets had a broken latch. Rebecca worked it carefully, not wanting to damage whatever might be inside. The door swung open to reveal custom foam padding cut to hold specific shapes. Cylinders, rectangles, something long and thin that might have been a probe or antenna. But the foam forms were empty. Whatever had been stored here was long gone. Interesting choice of hobby. Rebecca spun around, her heart hammering. A man stood silhouetted in the ambulance doorway, tall, thin, wearing an expensive wool coat that marked him as someone with money and taste. She hadn't heard him approach across the snow. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Rebecca kept her voice steady, but her hand drifted toward the heavy flashlight at her belt. Being alone in an isolated location with a stranger wasn't exactly her comfort zone. The man stepped closer, and she could see his face now. Maybe 50 years old, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Dr. James Crawford," he said, extending a hand. "I was at the auction today. Fascinating to see someone actually purchase that particular vehicle." Rebecca shook his hand cautiously. His grip was firm, but not aggressive, the hands of someone who worked with precision instruments rather than heavy tools. "Rebecca Martinez. And why is my purchase fascinating to you, Dr. Crawford?" Crawford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm a medical historian. I specialize in wartime innovations, the kind of medical field that developed under pressure and often disappeared when the shooting stopped. This ambulance," he gestured toward the modified interior, "this ambulance has quite a story." "What kind of story?" "The kind that makes people uncomfortable." Crawford climbed into the ambulance uninvited, his movements careful and deliberate. "Tell me, Ms. Martinez, what do you know about the Lend-Lease program?" Rebecca frowned. "World War II stuff. We sent supplies to Britain before we officially entered the war. What does that have to do with this ambulance?" "Everything." Crawford ran his fingers along the same scratches Rebecca had been examining. This vehicle wasn't just military surplus. It was part of a classified medical research program that operated between 1940 and 1942. Very classified, very controversial. The way he said it made Rebecca's skin crawl. Controversial how? Crawford was quiet for a long moment, studying the empty foam forms in the open cabinet. Have you ever heard of Dr. Eleanor Whitfield? No. Most people haven't. She was a brilliant trauma surgeon who developed revolutionary techniques for treating battlefield injuries, techniques that were decades ahead of their time. She worked out of mobile units like this one, testing new procedures under combat conditions. Testing on soldiers? Testing to save soldiers. Crawford's voice carried an edge of defensiveness. Dr. Whitfield's innovations saved hundreds of lives, maybe thousands, but her methods were unconventional. She operated outside normal medical protocols, used experimental drugs, performed procedures that hadn't been approved by any medical board. And people had a problem with that? Crawford laughed, but there was no humor in it. People had huge problems with that, especially when the war ended and certain individuals wanted to distance themselves from anything that might be considered ethically questionable. Dr. Whitfield's research was classified, then buried, then forgotten. Rebecca looked around the ambulance with new eyes. The precision modifications, the precision laboratory-grade equipment mounts, the chemical smell that still lingered after 80 decades. This was her mobile operating room. One of them. She had several units operating along the Atlantic coast, treating casualties from submarine attacks and training accidents. This particular ambulance was her primary research vehicle, where she developed her most groundbreaking techniques. What happened to her? Crawford's expression darkened. That's where the story gets complicated. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield disappeared in 1942. Her research notes vanished. Her equipment was scattered or destroyed. Official records claim she died in a training accident, but you don't believe that. I think Dr. Eleanor Whitfield was silenced because her work threatened too many powerful people. Military officials who didn't want questions asked about experimental medicine, pharmaceutical companies who didn't want competition from treatments they couldn't patent, politicians who needed clean narratives for the history books. Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. And you think the evidence is still here? In this ambulance? Crawford pulled out a small LED flashlight and directed its beam toward the stretcher. Dr. Whitfield was paranoid about her research being stolen or destroyed. She hid backup copies of everything, notes, formulas, equipment specifications. The question is, where? They searched in silence for several minutes, Crawford examining the walls while Rebecca focused on the stretcher mechanism. The frame was more complex than it appeared, with sliding sections and hidden compartments that would have allowed rapid reconfiguration for different procedures.
Crawford hesitated. Before we do, there's something else you should know. I'm not the only person interested in Dr. Whitfield's work. There are others, people who have spent decades making sure her research stays buried. If we find what I think we're going to find, they won't be happy about it. That's putting it mildly. Crawford met her eyes. Are you sure you want to go down this road? Once we open that panel, there's no going back. You'll be involved in something much bigger than restoring an old ambulance. Rebecca looked around the modified interior, thinking about the precision work that had gone into every detail. Someone had cared enough about their mission to invest enormous time and resources in this vehicle. Someone had believed their work was important enough to risk everything for. Dr. Whitfield, she said quietly. She was trying to save lives, right? More than that. She was trying to revolutionize how we treat trauma. Her techniques could have changed emergency medicine forever. Then we open it. Crawford nodded and pulled a multi-tool from his coat. The screws were corroded, but not seized, and they came out easier than Rebecca had expected. When the last one dropped to the floor with a metallic ping, Crawford gently pried the panel away from the wall. Behind it was a waterproof case about the size of a shoebox, sealed with rubber gaskets and secured with brass clasps that had somehow resisted 80 decades of New England weather. Rebecca could see through the clear plastic window on top, and her breath caught. Inside were papers, lots of them, handwritten notes in careful script, typed reports on official letterhead, and what looked like medical diagrams showing surgical procedures. But more importantly, there were photographs, black and white images of medical procedures being performed in the back of ambulances, showing techniques Rebecca had never seen before. "My God," Crawford whispered. "She documented everything." Rebecca was studying one of the photographs when something else caught her attention. In the corner of the image, partially visible behind the stretcher, was a piece of equipment she didn't recognize. It looked like a cross between a microscope and some kind of electronic device, with cables running to monitors that seemed far too advanced for the 1940s. "Dr. Crawford," she said slowly, "what exactly was Dr. Whitfield working on?" Crawford followed her gaze to the photograph, and his face went pale. Something that wasn't supposed to exist for another 40 years. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, and somewhere in the distance, Rebecca could hear the sound of a car engine approaching across the frozen ground. The car engine grew louder, tires crunching through snow as it navigated the dirt road leading to the barn. Crawford's face had gone from pale to ashen, and Rebecca watched him carefully seal the waterproof case and slide it back into its hiding place. "We need to leave," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Now." "Why? What's wrong with someone else being here?" Crawford was already replacing the metal panel, his fingers working frantically with the screws. They suddenly heard wood shattering and the sound of ice cracking under their weight. "Too late," Crawford muttered. He turned to Rebecca, his expression deadly serious. "Listen to me very carefully. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, you bought this ambulance as a restoration project, nothing more. You don't know anything about Dr. Whitfield, you've never heard of classified medical research, and you certainly haven't found any hidden documents. But we did find them. We found nothing." Crawford grabbed her shoulders. "Rebecca, these people have spent 80 years keeping this secret buried. They've destroyed careers, ruined lives, and done worse to protect what Dr. Whitfield discovered. Don't give them a reason to add you to that list." Footsteps approached across the frozen ground. Multiple sets moving with military precision. Rebecca could hear voices, low and professional, the kind of conversation that happened when people were coordinating a search. "Dr. Crawford," the voice came from just outside the ambulance, cultured and calm. "We know you're in there. Would you mind stepping out so we can have a conversation?" Crawford closed his eyes for a moment, then straightened his shoulders. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Rebecca. "Let me handle this." He climbed out of the ambulance with his hands visible, moving slowly and deliberately. Rebecca crouched in the shadows near the front of the vehicle, where she could hear but remain hidden. "Gentlemen," Crawford said, his voice remarkably steady, "to what do I owe the pleasure? You've been asking questions, Doctor. Questions about research that was classified decades ago. Questions about a medical program that officially never existed. I'm an historian. I ask questions about lots of things that officially never existed. Not like this, not about Dr. Eleanor Whitfield." Rebecca heard the sharp intake of Crawford's breath. Even hidden in the ambulance, she could feel the temperature of the conversation drop. "We have records of your inquiries, phone calls to archived medical facilities, FOIA requests for documents related to experimental wartime medicine, database searches for personnel records that were supposed to be destroyed in 1943. Academic research, perfectly legal." "Legal, perhaps, but inadvisable." A different voice joined the conversation, younger, with harder edges. "Especially when that research leads you to start examining vehicles that were supposed to have been scrapped decades ago." Through a gap in the ambulance's rear doors, Rebecca could see 3 men in dark coats standing in a semicircle around Crawford. They looked like federal agents or military intelligence, The kind of people who carried badges but never showed them unless absolutely necessary. "I'm restoring an old ambulance," Crawford said. "Again, perfectly legal." "You're not the one restoring it." The first voice again, patient but implacable. "That would be Ms. Rebecca Martinez, who purchased this vehicle at auction today for considerably more than its scrap value. The question is, why would a medical historian encourage a restoration specialist to buy a specific military ambulance? What did you expect her to find?" Rebecca's blood turned to ice water. They knew who she was. They'd been watching, probably since before the auction, maybe since Crawford had started making his inquiries. "I have no idea what you're implying," Crawford said. "We're implying that you've discovered something you shouldn't have, something that was buried for very good reasons." The younger voice was getting closer, and Rebecca could hear boots crunching in the snow as he moved. "Dr. Whitfield's research was classified because it was dangerous, not just to national security, but to public safety." "That's a lie." The words slipped out before Crawford could stop them, and Rebecca heard the anger that had been building beneath his calm facade. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield was a hero. She developed techniques that could have saved thousands of lives. Dr. Whitfield was a rogue who performed unauthorized experiments on wounded soldiers. Her revolutionary techniques violated every medical ethics standard that existed then or now. The Army buried her research to protect the families of the men she butchered in the name of science. You're rewriting history. We're protecting it. There's a difference. Rebecca could hear movement now, multiple people spreading out around the ambulance. They were positioning themselves to search the vehicle, and she was trapped inside with nowhere to go. "Dr. Crawford, we're going to need you to step away from the ambulance while we conduct a brief inspection. Standard procedure when classified materials might be involved." "You don't have a warrant." "We don't need one. This vehicle contains potential national security materials that were never properly disposed of. That gives us authority under several federal statutes that I'm sure you'd prefer not to have explained to you in detail." Rebecca heard Crawford take a step back, probably with little choice in the matter. She pressed herself against the ambulance's front wall, trying to become invisible as footsteps approached the rear doors. But then something unexpected happened. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" A new voice, elderly and cranky, cut through the tension like a rusty knife. Rebecca risked a peek through the gap in the doors and saw an old man in farmer's overalls trudging through the snow toward the group. He carried a shotgun broken open over his arm in the casual way of someone who'd been hunting since childhood. "This is private property, and I don't recall giving permission for any federal agents to conduct searches on my land." The first voice turned toward the newcomer, and Rebecca could hear the frustration beneath their calm facade. "Sir, this is a matter of national security. We have authority to—" "You have authority to show me a warrant signed by a judge, or you have authority to get the hell off my property before I call the sheriff and report a break-in. Mr. Franklin Morrison, and this is my barn, my land, and my patience you're testing." Rebecca realized that this must be the owner of the property where the ambulance had been stored, the man's whose estate sale had put the vehicle up for auction in the first place. "Mr. Morrison," the younger voice said, "we just need to inspect this vehicle for materials that might pose a security risk." "Security risk?" Morrison laughed, harsh and skeptical. "Son, that old meat wagon's been sitting behind my barn for 30 years. If it was going to blow up or start World War III, don't you think it would have done it by now? Sir, we really must insist, and I really must insist, that you produce a warrant or leave my property." Morrison's voice carried the kind of authority that came from 70 years of not backing down from anyone. "I fought in Korea, boy. I know the difference between legitimate government business and fishing expeditions." Rebecca could hear the agents talking among themselves in low voices, weighing their options. They clearly hadn't expected to deal with an uncooperative property owner, and they probably hadn't come prepared for a legal challenge to their authority. "This isn't over, Dr. Crawford. Your research into classified medical programs ends here. If we discover you've obtained any documents or materials related to Dr. Whitfield's work, there will be consequences." "Are you threatening me?" "We're advising you. Sometimes the difference is academic." More footsteps crunching through snow, car doors slamming, engines starting. Rebecca waited until the sound of the vehicles had faded completely before she dared to move. When she finally climbed out of the ambulance, she found Crawford and Morrison standing together in the snow, both looking shaken but determined. "Thank you," Crawford said to the farmer. "I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." Morrison spat into the snow. "Bunch of government bullies. I've seen their type before." He turned to Rebecca. "You're the young lady who bought my old ambulance?" "Yes, sir. Rebecca Martinez."
"Well, Rebecca Martinez, seems like you've bought yourself more than you bargained for." Morrison's eyes were sharp despite his age. That old meat wagon's got a story, and apparently there are people who don't want that story told. Crawford nodded grimly. "The question is, what do we do now?" Rebecca looked back at the ambulance, thinking about the waterproof case hidden in its walls, about Dr. Eleanor Whitfield and her revolutionary medical techniques, about 80 years of buried truth and the people who would do anything to keep it buried. "We find out what they're so afraid of," she said, "and then we make sure the world knows about it." Morrison grinned, showing teeth stained by decades of coffee and tobacco. "I like this girl. Dr. Crawford, I think you picked the right partner for this particular fight." But as the three of them stood in the falling snow, none of them noticed the small electronic device that had been quietly attached to the ambulance's undercarriage during the brief confrontation. The watchers had left, but they hadn't stopped watching. 3 days after the confrontation at Morrison's barn, Rebecca Martinez sat in her workshop at 2 a.m., surrounded by documents that shouldn't have existed. Crawford had insisted they retrieve the waterproof case immediately after the agents left, and what they'd found inside was unlike anything either of them had expected. The papers were organized with military precision, each section labeled in Dr. Whitfield's careful handwriting. Medical diagrams showed surgical procedures that looked decades ahead of their time. Chemical formulas described compounds that Rebecca couldn't identify. But most disturbing were the patient files, detailed records of treatments performed on soldiers whose injuries should have been fatal. "Look at this," Crawford said, spreading a hand-drawn schematic across Rebecca's workbench. "This is a design for a portable blood oxygenation system. We didn't develop technology like this until the 1980s. Rebecca studied the diagram, noting the precision of the technical drawings. Was she an engineer as well as a doctor? MIT graduate before medical school, theoretical physics and mechanical engineering. But this is what's really interesting. It's a requisition order for equipment that officially didn't exist. The form was dated September 1941 and signed by someone with enough authority to requisition experimental electronics from Bell Laboratories. Rebecca recognized some of the component descriptions: vacuum tubes, precision amplifiers, electromagnetic field generators, but others made no sense at all. "What's a cellular resonance detector?" she asked. Crawford shook his head. "I have no idea. But according to these notes, Dr. Whitfield believed she could use electromagnetic fields to accelerate healing at the cellular level. Look at this treatment log." He handed her a manila folder containing before and after photographs that made Rebecca's stomach clench. The first image showed a soldier whose left arm had been mangled by shrapnel, the kind of injury that would have meant amputation in 1941. The second photograph, dated just 2 weeks later, showed the same arm fully functional with barely visible scarring. "This is impossible," Rebecca whispered. "According to everything we know about medicine, yes,
But Dr. Whitfield documented dozens of similar cases. Soldiers who should have died from blood loss, who walked out of her mobile units within days. Patients with traumatic brain injuries who made complete recoveries. Crawford's voice was tight with excitement and disbelief. She wasn't just treating trauma, she was reversing it. Rebecca flipped through more photographs, each one more impossible than the last. A pilot with third-degree burns covering 60% of his body, healed without scarring. A Marine with a severed spinal cord who was walking within a month. A sailor who'd lost an eye to shrapnel and somehow regained his vision. No wonder the government buried this. If this technology had been released, it would have revolutionized medicine, eliminated most forms of disability, changed the fundamental nature of human health and longevity. Crawford pulled out a final document, this one sealed in a separate envelope marked "Eyes Only, Executive Authorization Required." Inside was a letter on White House letterhead, dated December 15, 1941, just 8 days after Pearl Harbor. Dr. Whitfield, your research has produced results beyond our most optimistic projections. However, the implications of your discoveries extend far beyond military applications. The President has authorized me to inform you that Project Lazarus is being reclassified at the highest levels of national security. Effective immediately, all research materials, equipment, and documentation are to be transferred to a secure facility for further evaluation. Your mobile units will be decommissioned and your staff reassigned to conventional medical duties. This decision is not a reflection on the quality or importance of your work. Rather, it acknowledges that some discoveries are too significant to be released without careful consideration of their long-term consequences for society. Your patriotic service will not be forgotten, even if it cannot be publicly acknowledged. Respectfully, Henry L. Stimson, Secretary of War. Crawford set the letter down carefully. December 15, 1941, Dr. Whitfield disappeared 3 months later, allegedly in a training accident that left no recoverable remains. Rebecca felt pieces clicking together in her mind. They didn't kill her to silence her. They killed her to steal her work, and then buried it because they couldn't control it. Think about what this technology would have meant in 1942. We're talking about the ability to heal any injury, cure any disease, potentially extend human life indefinitely, in the middle of World War II, with the entire global order hanging in the balance. So they decided no one should have it. They decided they weren't ready for the world it would create. But I think Dr. Whitfield saw this coming. I think she hid more than just these papers.
Rebecca looked up from a photograph showing a soldier who'd apparently regrown a severed hand. What do you mean? The equipment descriptions in these requisition orders. Some of these components weren't just advanced for 1941, they were impossible. Electromagnetic field generators that required power sources we didn't have. Cellular resonance detectors that depended on computer processing capabilities that wouldn't exist for decades. So, how did she build them? Crawford smiled grimly. She didn't. She designed them to be built later, when the technology caught up to her vision. Look at this. He pulled out a schematic that looked more like an engineering blueprint than a medical diagram. It showed a device the size of a briefcase, covered with controls and displays that seemed decades ahead of their time. This is labeled Portable Regeneration Unit Mark IV. But the components list includes integrated circuits, digital processors, and power cells that didn't exist in 1941. She was designing equipment for the future. Rebecca studied the blueprint more carefully. The device appeared to be some kind of sophisticated medical scanner, combined with an electromagnetic field generator. According to the notes, it could diagnose injuries at the cellular level and then direct healing energy to specific damaged tissues. It's like she knew someone would eventually find these plans and have the technology to build them. Exactly, and I think I know where she hid the prototypes. Crawford pulled out a map of Vermont, marked with locations in red ink.
Most were crossed out, but 3 remained circled. Morrison's barn, where they'd found the ambulance, a location marked Whitfield Estate, Burlington, and a third spot labeled simply Lab. The estate was sold off decades ago, but I did some research into Dr. Whitfield's personal property. She owned a cabin in the Green Mountains, officially listed as a hunting retreat, but the property records show some interesting details. He pointed to the third location on the map. She had electrical service installed that was completely out of proportion to a small cabin. Commercial-grade power lines, backup generators, underground cable runs. Plus, she filed permits for extensive excavation work, officially for a septic system. You think she built a hidden laboratory? I think Dr. Eleanor Whitfield spent the last months of her life preparing for the possibility that her official research would be confiscated. I think she built working prototypes of her equipment and hid them somewhere the government would never think to look. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Eleanor Whitfield had actually built functioning versions of the devices described in these plans, if the technology had been sitting hidden in the Vermont mountains for 80 years. "We have to find it," she said. Crawford nodded. "But we have to be careful. Those agents weren't bluffing about the consequences of pursuing this research. If we're right about what's hidden up there, there are people who will do anything to keep it buried." Rebecca looked back at the photographs of impossible healing, at soldiers who should have died but lived, at injuries that had been reversed by technology that officially never existed. He thought about the mockery she'd endured at the auction, the assumption that she was wasting her money on a piece of junk. If they were right, she hadn't bought scrap metal. She'd bought the key to the most revolutionary medical discovery in human history. "When do we leave?" she asked. Crawford checked his watch. "The cabin is about 2 hours north of here, up in the mountains near Stowe. The property's been abandoned since the 1940s, but the deed is still in Dr. Whitfield's name. Technically, it's government property now, which means we'll be trespassing on federal land to search for classified materials that were supposed to be destroyed 80 years ago." "Exactly." Rebecca grinned. "Sounds like a perfect way to spend a weekend." But as they packed the documents back into their waterproof case, neither of them noticed the small LED that had begun blinking on the tracking device attached to Rebecca's truck. Their watchers had been patient, waiting to see what the restoration specialist and the medical historian would do with their newfound knowledge. Now they knew, and in a secure facility 300 miles away, orders were being issued to ensure that Dr. Eleanor Whitfield's secrets remained buried, no matter what it cost. The race for the hidden laboratory was about to begin. The abandoned logging road wound through Vermont's Green Mountains like a scar across the landscape, barely wide enough for Rebecca's truck and choked with 80 decades of overgrowth. Pine branches scraped against the windows as they climbed higher into the wilderness, following GPS coordinates that led to a property that officially didn't exist. "According to the property records, we should be close," Crawford said, studying the map spread across his lap. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, casting shifting shadows that made it hard to distinguish between rocks and ruins. Rebecca downshifted as the road steepened, her truck's engine laboring against the grade. "How did Dr. Whitfield even get equipment up here? This road looks like it was barely passable in the 1940s. "She was resourceful, and she had military connections. If anyone could figure out how to move heavy machinery into the middle of nowhere, it would be someone with access to Army engineers." They'd been driving for 3 hours, leaving Rebecca's shop before dawn to avoid being followed. At least, they hoped they'd avoided being followed. The tracking device Crawford had found on Rebecca's truck the previous evening suggested their watchers were more thorough than they had initially realized. The cabin sat in a small clearing about 50 yards from where they'd stopped, and even from a distance, Rebecca could see that it wasn't the simple hunting retreat described in the property records. The structure was built from local stone and timber, but the proportions were wrong for a vacation home. Too many windows, too much electrical infrastructure, and too many antenna mounts on the roof for somewhere that was supposed to be a getaway from civilization. "Motion sensors," Crawford said quietly, pointing to small devices mounted on trees around the clearing's perimeter. Still functional after all these years. Rebecca followed his gaze and saw the telltale glint of solar panels partially hidden among the branches. Someone's been maintaining this place. They approached carefully, staying in the tree line until they could get a better view of the entire property. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from the road, with what looked like a substantial basement level built into the hillside. Power lines ran underground from a small hydroelectric generator fed by a stream that had been diverted through the property. Dr. Whitfield didn't just build a laboratory, Rebecca whispered. She built a self-sufficient research facility. The front door opened before they could decide whether to approach openly or continue their reconnaissance. "You can stop hiding in the trees," a woman's voice called across the clearing. "I've been watching you since you turned off Route 100. Rebecca and Crawford exchanged glances, then stepped into the open. The woman standing on the cabin's porch appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and clothes that suggested she spent most of her time outdoors. She carried a rifle with the casual competence of someone who'd been hunting her entire life. "Margaret Whitfield," the woman said as they approached. "Eleanor was my great-aunt, and you're the people who've been asking questions about research that was supposed to stay buried." Crawford stopped walking. "You're related to Dr. Whitfield?" "More than that. I'm her heir, her protector, and for the last 50 years, the guardian of everything she left behind." Margaret's eyes were sharp and suspicious. "The question is, what do you plan to do with what you found?" Rebecca felt pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. "You've been maintaining this place, keeping her work preserved." "Someone had to. The government thinks they destroyed everything when they killed Eleanor, but she was smarter than they gave her credit for. She knew they were coming for her, so she made sure her real discoveries would survive." Margaret gestured for them to follow her toward the cabin. She also made sure that only the right people would be able to find them, people who cared more about helping others than protecting institutional secrets. The interior of the cabin was a mixture of 1940s functionality and modern upgrades. The furniture was simple and practical, but Rebecca could see sophisticated electronic equipment humming quietly in corners, and the walls were lined with bookshelves containing medical texts spanning 8 decades. "Your truck has a tracking device," Margaret said without preamble. "Government issue, probably placed sometime in the last week. They know you're here." Crawford paled. "How long do we have?" "Depends on how badly they want to stop you. Could be hours, could be days, but they will come." Margaret led them to a bookshelf that covered most of one wall, "which means we need to move quickly." She pulled a specific combination of books from the shelf, and Rebecca heard the soft hum of electric motors. The entire bookshelf swung inward like a massive door, revealing a staircase that descended into the mountain. "Eleanor spent 2 years building this," Margaret explained as they descended into the underground facility. "The main laboratory is carved directly out of the bedrock, electromagnetically shielded and completely hidden from any kind of surface detection." The staircase opened into a cavern that took Rebecca's breath away. The space was enormous, easily the size of a small aircraft hangar, with smooth walls that showed the precision of professional excavation. But the contents were that made her stop and stare. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Devices that hummed with barely contained energy, displays showing complex waveforms and 3-dimensional molecular diagrams, and in the center of it all, a machine that looked exactly like the portable regeneration unit from Dr. Whitfield's blueprints. Except this one was the size of a small room. "She called it the Lazarus Chamber," Margaret said, following Rebecca's gaze. "The portable units were just prototypes. This is the full-scale version, designed to handle any kind of trauma or disease." Crawford was examining the equipment with the reverence of a pilgrim entering a shrine. "How is this possible? The technology required for this level of biomedical engineering didn't exist until the 1990s, according to conventional wisdom. But Eleanor wasn't working with conventional technology. She was working with principles that mainstream science still doesn't understand. Rebecca approached the chamber carefully. Through its transparent walls, she could see a bed surrounded by arrays of sophisticated sensors and field generators. The entire apparatus radiated a sense of power and precision that was almost intimidating. How does it work? Electromagnetic field manipulation at the quantum level, Margaret explained. Eleanor discovered that living tissue responds to specific electromagnetic frequencies in ways that can accelerate healing, regenerate damaged cells, and even reverse the aging process. But the frequencies have to be precisely calibrated for each individual patient, which requires computing power that didn't exist in the 1940s. Crawford looked up from a bank of monitors showing impossibly complex equations. So she designed the system to be completed later, when computer technology caught up to her vision.
Exactly. She built the mechanical components and left detailed instructions for the electronic systems. I've spent the last 30 years upgrading the computers and control systems as technology advanced. Margaret's voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness. The chamber became fully operational in 2010. "You've tested it?" Rebecca asked. Margaret rolled up her sleeve, revealing an arm that looked decades younger than the rest of her body. Stage 4 bone cancer, diagnosed 15 years ago. The doctors gave me 6 months to live. The chamber eliminated every trace of the disease and restored the damaged tissue to perfect health. Rebecca stared at the arm, then at Margaret's face. Now that she looked closely, she could see the subtle signs. Skin that was too smooth, eyes that were too bright, the kind of vitality that didn't belong on a 70-year-old woman. "How long," Rebecca began. "How long have I been using it? About 12 years. How long will it keep working? According to Eleanor's calculations, potentially indefinitely." Margaret moved to another control panel and began bringing additional systems online. "But that's not why I've maintained this place." The chamber's glow intensified, and Rebecca could feel energy in the air, like the moment before a lightning strike. Around the cavern, other machines began to activate, their displays showing readouts that scrolled too fast for human comprehension. Eleanor didn't just discover how to heal individual patients. She discovered how to heal anything: cancer, genetic disorders, traumatic injuries, degenerative diseases. The chamber can repair damage that conventional medicine considers irreversible. Crawford was reading from a logbook beside one of the workbenches. According to these notes, the system has been used successfully on over 200 subjects: terminal cancer patients, paralyzed accident victims, people with Alzheimer's disease, people who had nowhere else to turn, people who were dying while the government kept Eleanor's discoveries buried in classified files. Rebecca felt the magnitude of what she was seeing begin to sink in. This wasn't just about historical research or clearing a dead woman's name. This was about technology that could revolutionize human health, eliminate suffering that had plagued humanity for millennia, extend life in ways that bordered on science fiction. "Why haven't you gone public?" she asked. "With proof like this, with documented results?" Margaret's expression darkened. "Because the same people who killed Eleanor are still in power. The same organizations that buried her research are still protecting their interests. I've tried twice to contact medical journals, research institutions, even the media. Both times the people I contacted died in accidents before they could publish anything." "So you've been working alone?" "Until now." Margaret turned to face them directly. Eleanor's notes mentioned that someday the right people would find the ambulance, people who would understand what they'd discovered and have the courage to do something about it. She walked to a wall safe and removed a small device that looked like a sophisticated smartphone crossed with a medical scanner. "This is a portable version of the regeneration technology, not as powerful as the main chamber, but capable of treating most injuries and diseases. Eleanor designed it to be simple enough for emergency medical technicians to use in the field." Rebecca took the device carefully, feeling its weight and the subtle vibration of internal machinery. This could save millions of lives. "It could change the world," Margaret agreed, "but only if it reaches the right hands, people who will use it to help others, not to accumulate power or profit."
The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the cavern, still distant but growing closer. "They found us," Crawford said grimly. Margaret nodded, her expression calm despite the approaching danger. "I've been expecting this day for 30 years. The question is, are you ready to finish what Eleanor started?" Rebecca looked around the cavern, at technology that could eliminate human suffering, at the legacy of a woman who died trying to heal the world. Then she looked at the portable device in her hands and made the decision that would change everything. "What do you need us to do?" The helicopter rotors grew louder as Margaret moved with practiced efficiency through the laboratory, gathering essential equipment and documents. She'd clearly planned for this moment, her movements economical and purposeful as she prepared to abandon 80 years of hidden research. "There's an emergency exit through the back of the cavern," she said, stuffing data drives and notebooks into a waterproof pack. "It leads to a tunnel system that comes out about 2 miles north near an old mining road. But we need to destroy the main systems before we leave." Rebecca watched Margaret begin inputting commands into the chamber's control system. "Destroy it? This technology could save millions of lives." "Not if it falls into the wrong hands." Margaret's fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating what looked like a complete system shutdown. Eleanor learned that lesson the hard way. Revolutionary medical technology becomes revolutionary military technology faster than you can imagine. Crawford was reading from a logbook beside one of the workbenches. "According to these notes, the system has been used successfully on over 200 subjects. Terminal cancer patients, paralyzed accident victims, people with Alzheimer's disease, people who had nowhere else to turn, people who were dying while the government kept Eleanor's discoveries buried in classified files. The soldiers Dr. Whitfield treated, the ones who experienced miraculous recoveries, they didn't just heal from their injuries." Rebecca opened the file and found herself looking at medical records that spanned decades. The same soldier whose mangled arm she'd seen in the photograph tracked through regular medical examinations from 1942 to 1987. What she saw made her blood run cold. "He never aged," she whispered. "None of them did. Not significantly." Margaret pulled out more files, showing similar patterns across dozens of patients. Dr. Whitfield's treatment didn't just accelerate healing, it fundamentally altered the aging process. The electromagnetic fields that repaired damaged tissue also optimized cellular regeneration in ways that essentially stopped biological aging. Crawford looked up from his computer terminal, his face pale. The government didn't just bury revolutionary medical technology. They buried the secret to immortality. Now you understand why they were willing to kill for it." Margaret began walking toward the back of the cavern, where Rebecca could now see a steel door marked with radiation warning symbols. Imagine what happens when word gets out that not only can we cure any disease, we can also extend human life indefinitely. What happens to social security systems, to retirement plans, to the fundamental structure of human society? The helicopter sounds were much closer now, and Rebecca could hear boots on the ground above them. Their pursuers had found the cabin and were probably searching for the entrance to the underground facility. "But people deserve to know," Rebecca said, as they reached the steel door. "They deserve to have access to this technology." "I agree, but it has to be done carefully, gradually, with safeguards to prevent it from being weaponized or monopolized." Margaret input a long code into the door's electronic lock. That's why Eleanor left the clues in the ambulance. She was looking for people who would find the technology for the right reasons. The door opened onto a narrow tunnel that stretched into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on automatically, revealing a passage that had been carved with the same precision as the main laboratory. The mining company that helped Eleanor build this place had connections throughout the region. There are facilities like this hidden all over New England. Smaller operations, but equipped with the basic regeneration technology. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. How many people know about this? Fewer than you'd think. Maybe 50 individuals worldwide. Doctors, researchers, engineers, people who've spent decades quietly developing and refining Eleanor's work. We call ourselves the Whitfield Network. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Rebecca could see natural light ahead. They'd been walking for about 10 minutes, which meant they were well clear of whatever destruction Margaret had programmed for the main facility. The network has been preparing for this day, the day when the technology would finally be exposed and we'd have to move from hiding to action. We have manufacturing capabilities, distribution plans, training protocols for medical personnel. They emerged from the tunnel into a grove of pine trees where a camouflage shed concealed what looked like a high-end all-terrain vehicle. Margaret quickly transferred her pack to the vehicle and gestured for Rebecca and Crawford to get in. "Where are we going?" Crawford asked as Margaret started the engine with surprising quietness. "Boston. There's a hospital there where Dr. Sarah Chen has been using modified versions of Eleanor's techniques to treat terminal cancer patients. The results have been remarkable, but she's kept the work classified as experimental therapy to avoid government attention." Rebecca looked back toward the mountain as they drove away. She could see smoke rising from the direction of the cabin, and the helicopter was circling the area like a predatory bird. "How long before they realize we escaped?" "Not long. But the tunnel charges will have destroyed most of the evidence, and the computer systems were programmed to wipe themselves completely." Margaret navigated the rough mining road with practiced ease. "They'll know something was there, but they won't know what." Her phone buzzed with an incoming message. Margaret checked it quickly, then her expression darkened. "What is it?" Rebecca asked. "Dr. Chen's hospital. There was an electrical fire 20 minutes ago. The entire experimental treatment wing is gone." Crawford swore softly. "They're moving against the entire network." "It was inevitable once you started asking questions about Eleanor's research. We knew this day would come. The question is whether we can get the technology to the public before they can suppress all of us." Rebecca looked down at the portable regeneration device she still carried. It felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge of what it represented and what people had died to protect. "What exactly can this thing do?" she asked. "In the right hands, it can treat most cancers, reverse paralysis from spinal injuries, eliminate genetic disorders, and significantly slow the aging process. It's essentially a complete medical revolution in a device the size of a tablet computer." "And in the wrong hands?" Margaret's expression was grim. "It becomes the ultimate tool of control. Imagine a world where access to health and longevity is determined by wealth and political connections, where the powerful can live for centuries while the poor die of diseases that are easily curable." They drove in silence for several miles, each lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what they discovered. Rebecca found herself thinking about the laughter at the auction, the assumption that she was wasting her money on junk. If only they knew what that junk had led to. "There's something else," Margaret said finally. "The reason Eleanor chose to hide her work in that specific ambulance, in that specific location." "What do you mean?" "She was psychic. Not in any mystical sense, but she had an almost supernatural ability to predict patterns, to see connections that others missed. She chose that ambulance because she knew it would eventually find its way to someone like you." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. "Someone like me? Someone stubborn enough to see value where others saw worthlessness. Someone brave enough to pursue the truth even when it became dangerous. Someone who would choose to help others over protecting themselves." Crawford looked up from his phone, where he'd been monitoring news feeds. "It's starting to hit the media. Reports of coordinated raids on medical facilities in 6 states. They're calling it a national security operation targeting unauthorized medical experiments. Which means we have maybe 6 hours before every member of the network is either arrested or dead." Margaret reached into her pack and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified satellite phone. "Time to activate the emergency protocols." She began typing rapidly on the device's keypad, sending messages that Rebecca couldn't read, but understood were probably life-or-death communications to doctors and researchers across the country. "What's the plan?" Rebecca asked. "We go public. All of it. Every piece of research, every successful treatment, every bit of evidence that this technology works and has been deliberately suppressed for 80 years. Margaret finished her messages and looked directly at Rebecca. "But we need someone to be the face of the revelation. someone who found the truth accidentally and can't be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist or radical activist. Rebecca realized what Margaret was asking. You want me to tell the story? The media loves a narrative they can follow. A young woman restoring an old ambulance who stumbles onto the medical discovery of the century. It's the kind of story that captures public attention and makes it harder for the government to suppress. And what about you? What about the network? We disappear, go underground, set up new facilities in countries where the government can't reach us, continue the work from hiding while you and others fight the public battle. Rebecca looked at the portable regeneration device again, thinking about all the people it could help, all the suffering it could eliminate. Then she thought about the government agents who would do anything to keep it buried, about the decades of secrecy and suppression that had already cost countless lives. Okay, she said finally, I'll do it, but I want something in return. What? I want to understand exactly how this technology works. I want to be able to explain it, defend it, and teach others to build it, because if we're going to change the world, we need to do it right. Margaret smiled for the first time since they'd met. Eleanor would have liked you. She always said the best doctors were the ones who started as mechanics. As they drove toward Boston and an uncertain future, Rebecca Martinez held in her hands the key to the greatest medical breakthrough in human history. The question was whether she could survive long enough to share it with the world. Rebecca watched through the observation window as a young father carried his daughter into the treatment room. Emma Rodriguez, age 7, had been born with a genetic disorder that affected her muscle development. Conventional medicine had no cure, only management of symptoms that would worsen over time. The portable regeneration device changed everything. Rebecca positioned the device over Emma's spine and activated the treatment protocol Margaret had taught her. The machine hummed softly as it scanned the child's cellular structure, identified the genetic mutations causing her condition, and began transmitting the precise electromagnetic frequencies needed to repair the damaged DNA. "Will it hurt?" Emma asked, her voice small but brave. "Not at all," Rebecca smiled. "It feels kind of warm and tingly, like a very gentle massage." The treatment took 45 minutes. When it was complete, Emma's genetic disorder had been eliminated at the cellular level. Her muscles would develop normally. She would live a completely healthy life. "How is this possible?" Emma's father asked, tears streaming down his face as his daughter stood and walked with strength she'd never possessed before. Rebecca had answered that question hundreds of times in the past few months, but it never got easier to explain technology that seemed like magic. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield discovered that living tissue responds to specific electromagnetic frequencies, she said. When we apply the right frequency at the right intensity, we can essentially reprogram cells to repair themselves, eliminate genetic defects, and restore optimal function. And the government knew about this for 80 years? They were afraid of what would happen if everyone had access to it. They thought it would destabilize society, create economic chaos, upset the balance of power. Rebecca helped Emma down from the treatment table. They weren't entirely wrong. This technology is changing everything. And it was. The pharmaceutical industry was in chaos as diseases that had generated billions in revenue became instantly curable. Insurance companies were scrambling to restructure policies in a world where chronic illness was becoming obsolete. Governments were grappling with the social implications of a technology that could extend human life indefinitely. But for Rebecca, the changes that mattered most were the individual ones. Mrs. Chen, the grandmother who was losing her memory to dementia, now remembered her grandchildren's names and was planning to return to college. Marcus Williams, the veteran who had lost both legs in Afghanistan, was competing in marathons. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the researcher who had developed ALS at age 35, was back in her laboratory developing new applications for regeneration technology. The clinic's waiting room was full, as it was every day. people traveled from around the world to receive treatment that was still being restricted by government regulations in many countries. Rebecca and her team treated everyone they could, while fighting legal battles to make the technology more widely available. "Rebecca," Crawford called from the reception desk, "you need to see this." She found him staring at a news broadcast on the waiting room television. The reporter was standing outside a congressional building in Washington, and the headline read, "Whitfield Technology Protection Act Passes Senate." "What does that mean?" Crawford turned up the volume. "The landmark legislation ensures that regeneration technology will be available to all Americans regardless of economic status, while preventing foreign governments from restricting access to their citizens." Senator Patricia Morrison, who sponsored the bill, said this represents the most significant advancement in human rights since the abolition of slavery. Rebecca felt tears welling in her eyes. Senator Morrison was Franklin Morrison's daughter, the cranky farmer who had saved them from the government agents at his barn. His intervention that day had given them the time they needed to find the mountain laboratory and expose the truth. "There's more," Crawford said, switching to another news channel. "The International Health Council is recommending that regeneration technology be classified as a fundamental human right. 12 countries have already begun implementing free treatment programs." "And there's something else," Maria called from the treatment room. "Something you need to hear." Rebecca followed her to where Emma Rodriguez was playing with toys while her father completed paperwork. But Emma wasn't playing normally. She was building complex three-dimensional structures with blocks, solving spatial puzzles that should have been far beyond her 7-year-old capabilities. "The regeneration treatment," Maria said quietly, "it didn't just fix her genetic disorder, it optimized her entire neurological system, enhanced cognitive function, improved memory, increased processing speed." Rebecca watched Emma construct what appeared to be a scale model of the human brain using colored blocks. How much improvement? IQ tests this morning showed a 30-point increase from her baseline, but more importantly, she's demonstrating creative problem-solving abilities that are off the charts. Rebecca felt a chill of recognition. This was what Dr. Whitfield had really discovered, not just the ability to heal disease, but the potential to enhance human capabilities beyond their natural limits. The implications were staggering. "We need to document everything, every enhancement, every improvement, every unexpected effect. If this technology is optimizing human potential as well as eliminating disease, we're not just changing medicine, we're changing what it means to be human." Rebecca looked around the clinic, at the patients whose lives had been transformed, at the technology that had been hidden for 80 years, finally serving its intended purpose. She thought about Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, who had died protecting discoveries that could benefit all humanity. She thought about the government agents who had tried to keep those discoveries buried. She thought about the laughter at the auction house when she'd bought a worthless ambulance. The 1940 Dodge ambulance now sat in the Smithsonian Institution, permanently displayed as the vehicle that had led to the greatest medical breakthrough in human history. The plaque beside it read, "Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting for someone brave enough to look beyond the surface."
But for Rebecca Martinez, the real victory wasn't in the museums or the headlines or the congressional legislation. It was in the faces of the patients who walked out of her clinic healthy and whole, carrying with them the gift that Dr. Eleanor Whitfield had died trying to give the world. The gift of hope, healing, and unlimited human potential. As she prepared to treat the next patient, Rebecca's phone buzzed with a message from Margaret Whitfield, who was now running regeneration clinics in 12 countries where the technology was legal. "Eleanor would be proud," the message read. "The laughter has turned to wonder. The buried truth has become living hope. The work continues." Rebecca smiled and put her phone away. Outside, she could hear construction crews working on the expanded clinic that would open next month. Soon, they would be able to treat thousands of patients instead of hundreds.
Soon, the technology would be available in every hospital, every clinic, every place where human suffering could be eliminated. The world had changed, and it had changed because someone had refused to accept that a rusted ambulance was worthless junk. Sometimes the most revolutionary discoveries begin with the simplest decision: to look closer, to listen harder, and to believe that what others dismiss might hold the key to everything. In the end, they hadn't just laughed when she bought the ambulance. They had laughed at the future itself. But the future had the last laugh after all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.